Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Life Before. Thomas Black had always believed in three things: God, country, and family. In that order. But on the day he shipped out to Afghanistan for his third deployment, he'd wondered if maybe he'd gotten the order wrong. His son Justin, barely 12 years old, had gripped his hand at the airport with the kind of desperation that made Thomas's chest ache. "Dad, do you have to go?" "I do, buddy, but I'll be back before you know it." Thomas had crouched down, meeting those scared brown eyes. "You're the man of the house now. Take care of your mom for me." Justin had nodded, but there was something in his expression, a flicker of doubt, maybe even fear, that Thomas couldn't quite place. He'd chalked it up to deployment jitters. Kids were resilient. Patricia would hold things together. Patricia Mayer Black had been his high school sweetheart, the girl who'd waited for him through boot camp, through Ranger School, through 2 previous deployments. She'd been his rock, or so he'd thought. The woman he'd married 16 years ago had honey blonde hair, a quick smile, and dreams of being a nurse. The woman who'd driven him to the airport that morning had been different, distracted, irritable, already halfway gone. "You're really doing this again?" she'd said, not even looking at him as she drove. "It's my job, Pat. You knew what you signed up for." "Did I?" She'd laugh then, a bitter sound. "Did I sign up for raising a kid alone? For bills I can barely pay? For sleeping in an empty bed more nights than not?" Thomas had reached for her hand, but she'd pulled away. "When I get back. When you get back, it'll be the same. You'll be here for 3 months, maybe 4, and then you'll be gone again. That's not a marriage, Thomas. That's a subscription service." He hadn't known what to say to that. The truth was, she wasn't entirely wrong. Special Forces operators didn't get regular schedules. They got called and they went. But he was good at it. Damn good. He'd saved lives, completed missions that kept Americans safe. Didn't that count for something? Apparently not. Thomas's background was what the Army called unconventional. Raised by a single mother in rural Montana after his father died in a logging accident, he learned early that life didn't give you second chances. You made your own luck, created your own opportunities. The military had given him structure, purpose, and a way to channel the cold analytical mind that made him seem distant to people who didn't know him. But those who knew him, really knew him, understood that Thomas Black was loyal to the bone. He remembered everything, forgot nothing, and always paid his debts, good ones and bad ones. His team leader, Luther Daniel, had pulled him aside before the flight. "You're ahead in the game, Black." "Always is, sir." "Good, because where we're going, distraction gets people killed." Luther was a career officer, a man who'd come up through the ranks the hard way. He had more combat experience than most men had birthdays, and he didn't suffer fools. "You got something to say it now." Thomas had hesitated. "Permission to speak freely?" "Granted. I think my marriage is ending." Luther had studied him for a long moment. "Then end it or save it. But don't let it eat at you over there. We need you sharp." "I will be." And he had been. For 6 months, Thomas had pushed thoughts of home to the back of his mind, focusing on the mission, on his team, on staying alive. He'd led reconnaissance operations deep into Taliban territory, had called in airstrikes that dismantled insurgent cells, had pulled a wounded teammate 3 miles through hostile terrain to an extraction point. He'd been decorated twice. He'd also been cuckolded. The first hint came in an email from his neighbor, Flora Santos, an elderly woman who'd lived next door for 20 years. "Thomas, I don't want to worry you, but I think you should know there's a man staying at your house. Patricia says he's a friend, but he's there most nights. Justin seems upset. Call when you can." He'd called. Patricia's phone had gone to voicemail. Justin's too. Flora had answered on the first ring. "Mrs. Santos, it's Thomas. What's going on?" "Oh, honey." Her voice had cracked. "I didn't want to be the one to tell you, but that boy, Patricia's friend, he's trouble. I've seen him and his buddies out there, drinking on your porch, smoking God knows what. And Justin. Thomas, that child is scared." "Scared of what?" "Of him. Of Clint something or other. He's mean, Thomas. I've heard him yelling at Patricia, at Justin. Last week, I saw Justin with a bruise on his arm. When I asked him about it, he said he fell. But I don't think he fell." Thomas's blood had gone cold. "I'm going to make some calls." He tried Patricia again, and again. Finally, she'd answered, and he'd heard music in the background, laughter, the clink of bottles. "What do you want, Thomas?" "Who's Clint?" Silence. Then, a friend. "Mrs. Santos says he's living in my house." "It's my house, too. And yeah, he's staying here." "So what? You're never here anyway." "Patricia, if he's laying hands on Justin." "He's not. Justin's fine. Stop believing gossip from nosy old women." Then put Justin on the phone. "He's asleep. It's 4 in the afternoon there. Then he's doing homework." "I don't know, Thomas. I'm not his warden. You're his mother. And you're never here to be his father," she'd screamed. "You left us. You always leave. So don't you dare call me from halfway around the world and judge how I'm living my life." The line had gone dead. Thomas had sat in his bunk that night, staring at the ceiling of the barracks, listening to the sounds of the base around him. He'd thought about Justin's face at the airport, that flicker of fear. He'd thought about Patricia's bitterness, her anger, the way she'd pulled her hand away from his. And he'd thought about a man named Clint who was sleeping in his bed, living in his house, and, if Flora was right, putting hands on his son. In that moment, Thomas Black had made a decision. He would finish his deployment. He would do his duty, and then he would go home and fix what was broken, or burn it all down trying. Chapter 2. The Descent. 2 months crawled by like years. Thomas had tried calling every week, but Patricia rarely answered. When she did, the conversations were brief and cold. Justin answered more often, but the boy's voice had changed. It was quieter now, more hesitant, like he was afraid of being overheard. "How's school, buddy?" "It's okay. Your grades holding up?" "Yeah, Dad. I'm doing fine." "And everything else?" "Everything at home." A pause. "It's fine." But it wasn't fine. Thomas could hear it in what Justin didn't say, in the silences between words, in the way the boy rushed through their conversations like he was on borrowed time. Luther had noticed the change in him. "Black, you're wound tight. What's going on?" "Just home stuff, sir." "I'll handle it." "You keep saying that, but you look like you're about to snap." Luther had pulled him aside after a briefing. "Look, I've been where you are. Deployed, worried about home, feeling helpless. It eats at you, but you can't let it affect your performance. Talk to me." So Thomas had told him. About Patricia, about Clint, about Justin's fear and Flora's concerns, and the way his marriage had crumbled like sand through his fingers. Luther had listened in silence, his weathered face unreadable. When Thomas finished, the colonel had simply said, "When we get back, you handle it. Whatever needs to be done. But until then, you focus here." "Understood." Understood. But focusing became harder when the emails from Flora started coming more frequently. "Thomas, the police were at your house last night. Noise complaint. I could hear the music from my bedroom." "Thomas, I saw Justin walking to school alone in the rain yesterday. When I offered him a ride, he said his mom was asleep and couldn't drive him. It was 7:30 a.m. "Thomas, I think you need to come home. I don't know what's happening in that house, but it's getting worse." He tried calling Child Protective Services, but without concrete evidence of abuse, they could only do a welfare check. Patricia had convinced the social worker that everything was fine, that Flora was a meddling neighbor, that Justin was healthy and happy. Case closed. Thomas had felt the rage building in him, cold and patient. He'd started documenting everything. Every missed call, every concerning email, every conversation where Justin sounded afraid. He'd created a file, meticulous and detailed, because Thomas Black didn't do anything halfway. He'd also started digging into Clint Roach. It wasn't hard. One of Thomas's teammates, Mike Lyons, had connections in law enforcement. A few phone calls, some off-the-books database searches, and a picture emerged. Clint Roach, age 34. Multiple arrests for drug possession, assault, and theft. No convictions. He was either lucky or had good lawyers. Known associate of a local motorcycle club with ties to methamphetamine distribution. Currently unemployed. Currently living in Thomas Black's house, sleeping in Thomas Black's bed, and, based on Flora's reports, terrorizing Thomas Black's son. "This guy's a piece of work," Mike had said, sliding the printed file across the table. "Real winner your wife picked." Thomas had stared at Clint's mugshot. Hard eyes, sneering mouth, the kind of face that promised violence. "He's got friends," Mike had continued. "Dale Ray and Ed Juarez. Both with records. They run together, get high together, get arrested together. Real tight crew. And they're around my son. Yeah, man. I'm sorry. Thomas had folded the file carefully and tucked it into his pack. Don't be. I'm not. What are you going to do? What needs to be done? The mission had stretched longer than expected. What was supposed to be a 6-month deployment had become 8, then 9. Each day felt like a lifetime. Each call home revealed new horrors in small doses. Justin had stopped playing soccer. His grades had dropped. Patricia had lost weight, her voice taking on a manic edge when she bothered to answer the phone at all. And then, 3 weeks before Thomas was scheduled to return home, Flora had sent an email that made his blood run cold. Thomas, I called the police again tonight. I heard screaming. A man was yelling at Justin, calling him terrible names. When the officers arrived, Patricia told them everything was fine. Justin confirmed it. But Thomas, I saw his face through the window. That child is terrified. I don't know what to do. Please come home. Thomas had gone to Luther immediately. Sir, I need emergency leave. On what grounds? Family emergency. Luther had studied him. You've got 3 weeks left on this deployment. Can it wait? No, sir. It can't. Then give me the details. Thomas had laid it all out. The emails, the phone calls, the police reports, the background on Clint and his friends. When he finished, Luther had been quiet for a long moment. I can't give you emergency leave without evidence of imminent danger. But Luther had tapped his fingers on the desk. I can fast-track your departure. Get you out of here in 72 hours instead of 3 weeks. That work? It'll have to. Those 72 hours have been torture. Thomas had tried calling Justin every day. The boy hadn't answered. Neither had Patricia. Flora had reported seeing Clint's motorcycle parked in the driveway every night. Music blaring at all hours, strange people coming and going. Finally, mercifully, Thomas had boarded a transport plane headed for Germany, then another to North Carolina, and finally a commercial flight to Great Falls, Montana. He'd arranged for a rental car, planned his route home, and tried not to think about what he might find when he got there. The flight landed at 2:17 p.m. Mountain Time. Thomas had been awake for 36 hours straight, but adrenaline and fury kept him moving. He'd collected his bag, picked up the rental, and started the 2-hour drive to his hometown of Cascade. His phone had been off during the flights. When he turned it on, there were 17 missed calls from Justin, and 1 voicemail. Thomas had pulled over on the side of the highway and played it with shaking hands. Justin's voice, barely a whisper, Dad, Dad, please. I need you. Mom's boyfriend. He's here with his friends. They're high, really high. They're talking about. They're betting on who gets to. Dad, they said they're going to kill me. They're laughing about it. Clint said, your father is deployed and can't save you. Dad, I'm scared. I'm in my room. I'll lock the door, but I don't know if that'll be enough. Please, please come home. The voicemail was time-stamped 43 minutes ago. Thomas's hands had clenched around the steering wheel so hard it creaked. He pulled up the GPS, calculated the distance. From where he was, his house was 2 hours and 12 minutes away. Unacceptable. He called Luther Daniel immediately. Sir, I need you to do something for me. I need you to do it now, and I need you not to ask questions until after. Talk to me, Black. I need you to mobilize whoever you can get from the battalion. I'm sending you an address. Get them there in the next 10 minutes, or my son dies. There had been a pause. Then, consider it done. Thomas had hung up and made a second call to the Montana Highway Patrol. This is Staff Sergeant Thomas Black, serial number XXXXXXXX. I'm reporting a hostage situation at 1847 Pinewood Drive, Cascade, Montana. Suspects are armed, under the influence of narcotics, and threatening to kill a minor. The minor is my 12-year-old son. I need immediate response. Do you copy? Copy that, Sergeant. Units are en route. Thomas had ended the call and pressed the accelerator to the floor. He made a promise to Justin 8 months ago. I'll be back before you know it. He was about to keep it. Chapter 3, 8 minutes. Thomas drove like the devil himself was chasing him. Or maybe he was the devil, chasing down men who'd threatened his son. Either way, the rental car's engine screamed as he pushed it past 90, then 100 miles per hour on the rural Montana highway. His phone rang. Luther. I've got 12 men assembled from a unit that hasn't shipped out yet. We're 23 minutes from your address. What's the situation? My son is barricaded in his room. 3 suspects, Clint Roach, Dale Ray, and Ed Juarez, are in the house, high on meth, threatening to kill him. They think I'm in Afghanistan. They're wrong. Rules of engagement: secure my son. Subdue the suspects. If they resist, Thomas's voice had gone flat, emotionless. Use your judgment, sir. And you? Where are you? 8 minutes out. Thomas. Luther's voice had softened just slightly. Don't do anything you can't walk back from. I won't do anything I'll regret. Thomas had ended the call. The miles blurred past. He'd grown up on these roads, knew every curve and straightaway. He used that knowledge now, cutting corners, accelerating through turns that would have made a civilian driver pray for their life. 6 minutes out, he called Justin. The phone had rung 4 times, and Thomas's heart had climbed into his throat. Then, Dad, a whisper, terrified and small. Justin, buddy, I need you to listen very carefully. Lock your door if you haven't already. Push your dresser in front of it. Get in your closet and don't come out until I tell you to. Do you understand? You're here? Dad, you're actually here. 8 minutes. Maybe less. Can you do what I said? Yeah. Yeah, I can. Dad, I'm scared. I know, but you're going to be okay. I promise you, son. You're going to be okay. From somewhere in the house, Thomas had heard a man's voice, slurred and aggressive. Justin, get your ass out here. We got a game to play. Go. Now. Closet. Don't come out. The line had gone dead. Thomas had thrown the phone onto the passenger seat and gripped the wheel with both hands. His mind was cold, calculating. 3 targets, all intoxicated, likely armed, definitely dangerous. He'd gone through scenarios in his head. Breach points, sight lines, escape routes. He'd built that house with his own hands when Justin was born, knew every inch of it. The front door opened to the living room. Kitchen to the right. Hallway to the left leading to 3 bedrooms. Justin's room was at the end of the hall. If they were high and betting on who would get to Justin first, they'd be focused on that hallway. They wouldn't expect resistance. They certainly wouldn't expect him. Good. Thomas had pulled onto his street 4 minutes later, the house appearing at the end of the cul-de-sac. 3 motorcycles were parked in his driveway. Lights blazed from every window. Music pounded loud enough to shake the walls. And in his front yard, sitting on the porch, Clint Roach had been laughing. Thomas had parked the rental across the street and stepped out into the cool Montana evening. He'd still been wearing his army fatigues from the flight, boots laced tight, muscles coiled like springs. Clint had looked up, squinting through the drug haze. The hell are you supposed to be? I'm the father. Thomas's voice had been calm, almost conversational. You're my house. You threatened my son. You have about 30 seconds to walk away before I make the last mistake of your life. Clint had stood, swaying slightly. He'd been bigger than his mugshot suggested. 6'2", maybe 240, with prison tattoos crawling up his neck. Oh shit, you're the army boy. Patricia said you wouldn't be back for weeks. Patricia was wrong. Well, ain't that a bitch? Clint had grinned, and Thomas had seen the madness in his eyes, the kind that came from too many drugs and too few consequences. But see, the thing is, I live here now. This is my house. That's my woman inside. And that little shit, Justin, he's been disrespecting me all day. So me and my boys, we decided to teach him some manners. By threatening to kill him. Oh, you heard that? Clint had laughed. We were just playing around. Kid can't take a joke. Thomas had taken a step forward. Here's a joke for you. What do you call 3 meth heads who threaten a 12-year-old boy? What? Dead men. Clint's smile had faded. You threatening me? In front of witnesses. He gestured to the house. Dale, Ed, get out here. The front door had opened, and 2 more men had stumbled out. Dale Ray was thin and twitchy, with hollow cheeks and wild eyes. Ed Juarez was shorter, but built like a bull, with scarred knuckles that suggested he enjoyed fighting. This the dad? Dale had asked. Yeah, and he's got a mouth on him. Ed had cracked his knuckles. Want us to shut it? Thomas hadn't moved. He'd simply stood there, watching them, calculating. 3 targets, all impaired. Ed would be the most dangerous. He looked like he had training. Dale would be fast, but weak. Clint was the wild card, high enough to feel no pain, but stupid enough to make mistakes. Last chance, Thomas had said. Walk away now, and I'll let the police handle this. Stay, and I handle it my way. Clint had pulled a knife from his back pocket, a cheap gas station blade, the kind that folded and locked. See, Army boy, I don't think you understand how this works. This is my town now, my house, my rules. And you're just The sound of engines had cut him off. Heavy engines, multiple vehicles. They'd turned as a convoy of Army trucks rounded the corner. 3 Humvees and a transport carrier, all bearing the insignia of Thomas's battalion. They'd pulled up in a semicircle around the house, blocking every exit, and armed soldiers had poured out, weapons at the ready. Luther Daniel had stepped from the lead vehicle, his uniform crisp despite the late hour. Secure the perimeter. I want eyes on all exits. No one leaves. Thomas had watched Clint's face go white. Dale had dropped to his knees immediately, hands in the air. It had looked like he wanted to run, but 20 rifles pointed in his direction had convinced him otherwise. What the F-U-C-K? Clint had stammered. You can't do this. This is illegal. You can't bring the fucking military into a civilian. Shut up, Thomas had said quietly. He'd walked past Clint, past the soldiers, straight to his front door. Inside, the house was a disaster. Beer cans and liquor bottles littered every surface. The coffee table was covered with drug paraphernalia, pipes, needles, burnt spoons. The walls he'd painted himself were scuffed and stained. And in the center of it all, Patricia had sat on the couch, staring at the sudden influx of soldiers with wide, uncomprehending eyes. She looked terrible. Her skin was sallow, her hair unwashed, her clothes hanging off a frame that had lost too much weight. When she saw Thomas, something flashed in her eyes, fear, maybe, or guilt, or both. Thomas, where's Justin? His room. He's fine. Thomas had walked past her without another word, down the hallway that led to his son's room. The door was closed, a dresser pushed against it from the inside. He knocked gently. Justin, it's Dad. Open up. For a moment, nothing. Then the sound of furniture scraping, a lock clicking, and the door had opened to reveal his son. Thin, pale, terrified, but alive. Justin had looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much, and then he'd collapsed into Thomas's arms, sobbing. I've got you, Thomas had whispered, holding his son tight. I've got you, buddy. You're safe now. Outside, he'd heard Clint screaming as soldiers zip-tied his hands. He'd heard sirens as local police arrived. He'd heard Luther barking orders, organizing the scene. But in that moment, all Thomas heard was his son's heartbeat against his chest, rapid and alive. He'd kept his promise. 8 minutes. Chapter 4, The Aftermath. The Cascade Police Department descended on Thomas's house like locusts, filling the quiet street with flashing lights and urgent radio chatter. Neighbors had gathered on their lawns, Flora Santos among them, her hand pressed to her mouth as she watched soldiers and police officers swarming the property. Sheriff Gerald Morrison arrived 12 minutes after the initial call, his weathered face tight with confusion and barely controlled anger. He was a local man, born and raised in Cascade, and he didn't appreciate armed military personnel operating in his jurisdiction without warning. Someone want to tell me what the hell is going on here? He demanded, stepping out of his cruiser. Luther Daniel had met him at the property line, his posture rigid and formal. Colonel Luther Daniel, United States Army. We responded to a hostage situation involving a minor child, son of one of my men. This is civilian jurisdiction, Colonel. You had no authority to bring military assets here. With respect, Sheriff, when one of my soldiers reports that his son is being threatened with imminent death, I respond. We secured the scene. Your people can take it from here. Morrison had looked past Luther to where Clint, Dale, and Ed were being processed by police officers. All 3 were high as kites, screaming about their rights, trying to explain away the drugs, the weapons, the recorded threats. It wasn't going well for them. That the suspects? 3 men found on the property, all intoxicated, all in possession of methamphetamine and drug paraphernalia. The homeowner's son was barricaded in his bedroom, reporting credible death threats. We detained them until your arrival. Morrison had sighed, running a hand through his gray hair. "And where's the homeowner?" "Inside with his son." The sheriff had found Thomas in Justin's room, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, his son curled up beside him. The boy had finally stopped crying, but he hadn't let go of his father's arm. "Staff Sergeant Black?" Thomas had looked up, his eyes cold and alert despite the exhaustion. "Sheriff, I need to ask you some questions." "Ask." Morrison had glanced at Justin. "Maybe the boy should." "He stays with me," Thomas had said flatly. "He doesn't leave my sight until those men are in a cell." "Fair enough." Morrison had pulled out a notepad. "Tell me what happened." So Thomas had told him about the deployment, the phone calls, the emails from Flora, the missed calls from Justin, about the voicemail that had sent him speeding across Montana with murder in his heart, about arriving home to find 3 drug-addled criminals threatening his son's life. "And you called in the Army?" "I called my commanding officer and requested assistance in a hostage situation." "That's not how this works, Sergeant. You should have called us." "I did. 43 minutes earlier. I also told them it was urgent. But you know how dispatch works. Domestic situations get low priority unless there's confirmed violence. My son didn't have 43 minutes. Morrison had closed his notepad. "Look, I understand you were scared. Any father would be. But rolling in here with a battalion? That's excessive force." That's my son being alive," Thomas had interrupted. "Those men were high on methamphetamine, armed, and actively planning to harm a child. If excessive force saved his life, I'll sleep just fine." The sheriff had studied him for a long moment. "We found drugs, weapons, and your wife's boyfriend has a record longer than my arm. The DA will probably file attempted assault charges at minimum. Maybe kidnapping, child endangerment. But you need to understand, this situation could have gone very badly. You're lucky no one got hurt." "I'm not lucky, Sheriff. I'm prepared." Morrison had shaken his head and left them alone. Over the next 2 hours, the house had been processed as a crime scene. Police had photographed everything: the drugs, the weapons, the threatening text messages on Clint's phone that outlined exactly how he planned to teach that little shit a lesson. They'd interviewed Justin, who'd recounted the entire evening in a shaking voice while Thomas held his hand. Patricia had been interviewed separately. She'd claimed ignorance, said she didn't know Clint and his friends were that high, didn't know they'd threatened Justin, had been in the bedroom when it all happened. The police hadn't believed her, but she wasn't being charged. Yet, when they'd finally let Thomas leave with Justin, he'd found Flora waiting on her porch. "Thomas." She'd hugged him tight, this woman who'd watched him grow up, who'd baked him cookies as a child and kept an eye on his house when he was deployed. "Thank God you made it in time. Thank you for calling. For warning me. That boy needs you." She'd looked at Justin, who was pressed against his father's side. "You staying here?" "Not tonight. I'll find a hotel." "Nonsense. You'll stay with me. I got a spare room, and Justin can take the couch. It's not much, but it's clean and safe." Thomas had wanted to refuse, but one look at his son's exhausted face had changed his mind. "Thank you, Mrs. Santos." They'd stayed with Flora that night and the next, while Thomas began the process of cleaning up the wreckage of his life. The house would need to be gutted. The smell of drugs had seeped into the walls. The furniture was ruined, and there were bloodstains on the carpet from one of Ed's nosebleeds. Insurance would cover some of it, but not all. More importantly, Thomas had filed for divorce. He'd gone to a lawyer, Clarence Garcia, a sharp-eyed man who'd served in the Marines before going to law school. Garcia had listened to the entire story without interruption, and when Thomas finished, he'd simply said, "I'll have papers drawn up by tomorrow. Sole custody based on child endangerment. She won't fight it. Not with what happened. She'll fight it," Thomas had said. "Not because she wants Justin, but because she won't want to lose. Let her try. The police report alone will bury her." Patricia had indeed fought it. She'd hired her own lawyer, Spencer Jefferson, a sleazy divorce attorney who specialized in fleecing military men during deployments. Jefferson had argued that Patricia was a victim too, that she'd been manipulated by Clint, that she deserved a second chance. But the evidence had been overwhelming. Child Protective Services had gotten involved, interviewing Justin multiple times. The boy had told them everything, about Clint's rages, about being left alone for days while Patricia partied, about the bruises, the fear, the night he genuinely believed he was going to die. The judge had ruled in Thomas's favor. Sole custody, supervised visitation for Patricia, pending completion of drug rehabilitation and parenting classes. The house would be sold, assets divided, and Patricia would receive minimal alimony given her role in the endangerment. She'd screamed at Thomas on the courthouse steps. "You destroyed my life. You took everything from me." "No," Thomas had said quietly. "You did that yourself. I just made sure you didn't destroy our son in the process." But that wasn't the end. Because while the legal system had worked, slowly, bureaucratically, but it had worked, Thomas wasn't satisfied. Clint, Dale, and Ed were looking at charges, yes. But charges could be plea bargained. Sentences could be reduced. Men like that had a way of slithering through the cracks of the justice system. Thomas Black didn't believe in cracks. He believed in certainty. Chapter 5, The Investigation. While the legal proceedings ground forward, Thomas had conducted his own investigation. He'd learned during his time in Special Forces that sometimes the best revenge wasn't violence. It was information. He'd started with Clint's phone, which police had returned to him as part of the discovery process in the criminal case. Thomas had given it to Mike Lyons, who had a side business in digital forensics. "What am I looking for?" Mike had asked. "Everything. Contacts, messages, emails, app data. Anything that tells me who this man really is." Mike had delivered 3 days later with a USB drive full of recovered data. "This guy's dumber than a box of rocks. Never deleted anything. I've got texts going back 2 years, including some real interesting conversations." Thomas had spent an entire night reading through Clint Roach's digital life, and what he'd found had been enlightening. Clint wasn't just a meth user. He was a dealer. Small time, but consistent. He'd been selling to half the county, including some surprising names. The son of the mayor, a teacher at Justin's school, a deputy in Morrison's department. More interesting were the conversations between Clint, Dale, and Ed. They'd been planning something big. A deal with a supplier from Colorado, something involving 50 pounds of methamphetamine with a street value north of $500,000. The deal was supposed to go down 2 weeks after the incident at Thomas's house. But here's where it got interesting. Clint had been bragging about his connections, about how he had insurance in case anything went wrong. That insurance came in the form of photographs and videos, evidence of his clients using and dealing drugs. He'd been blackmailing them, essentially running a protection racket where people paid him to keep quiet about their habits. Thomas had made copies of everything and delivered them to Sheriff Morrison personally. "The hell is this?" Morrison had asked, looking at the USB drive. Evidence of ongoing drug trafficking. Names, dates, transactions. All recovered from Clint Roach's phone. "I thought you might be interested." Morrison had gone pale as he'd scrolled through the files. "Jesus Christ. This implicates half the town." "I know, including Deputy Lewis Birch." The sheriff had looked up sharply. "Lewis? Check the messages dated March 12th. He's been feeding Clint information about drug raids and investigations. He's on the payroll." Morrison had made several phone calls that afternoon. By evening, Deputy Birch had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. By the end of the week, he'd been arrested. But Thomas hadn't stopped there. He'd also discovered that Clint had been skimming from his supplier, a man known only as Spider, based in Denver. Clint owed Spider nearly $80,000, and Spider wasn't known for his patience. Thomas had made an anonymous call to a number listed in Clint's contacts under "Don't answer unless emergency." A rough voice had answered. "Who's this?" "Someone who knows Clint Roach owes you money." "A lot of it." Silence. Then, "I'm listening. He's currently in jail in Cascade, Montana, awaiting trial for attempted murder of a minor. He won't be making his payment. Thought you should know. Appreciate the heads up." The line had gone dead. 3 days later, Clint had been attacked in jail. Nothing fatal. Broken nose, cracked ribs, a message carved into his chest with a sharpened toothbrush that read, "Pay up." The guards had written it off as a typical jail fight, but Thomas had known better. Spider had a long reach. Dale Ray had been easier. He'd had a parole violation from a previous drug charge, and a new arrest had meant automatic revocation. He'd be going back to prison for at least 5 years. No plea deal possible. Ed Juarez had been the most complicated. He'd had no priors, and his lawyer had been pushing hard for a reduced sentence, arguing that Ed hadn't directly threatened Justin, had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Thomas had needed more. He'd gone through Ed's background with a fine-tooth comb, employment history, known associates, financial records. And he'd found something interesting. Ed had been dishonorably discharged from the Army 8 years prior for theft. He'd stolen from other soldiers during basic training, pawned their belongings, and got caught. The discharge meant he'd forfeited all veterans' benefits and carried a permanent mark on his record. But more interestingly, Ed had been bragging online, on a closed Facebook group for former military, about how to game the VA system and get benefits you're not entitled to. He'd been advising other dishonorably discharged veterans on how to forge documents and claim PTSD for disability payments. Thomas had compiled the evidence and sent it to the VA's Office of Inspector General. Fraud charges had followed, adding federal offenses to Ed's state charges. All three men were now facing significant prison time. Clint was looking at 15 to 20 years. Dale had 5 years minimum. Ed was facing 10 to 15 between state and federal charges. But Thomas still wasn't satisfied, because Patricia, the woman who'd allowed these men into his home, who'd chosen drugs and parties over their son's safety, was getting off with nothing more than supervised visitation and rehab. That didn't sit right. Chapter 6, The Plan. Thomas had always been patient. It was one of the things that made him good at his job, the ability to wait, to watch, to gather intelligence before acting. He'd spent weeks observing Patricia from a distance, learning her routines, understanding her new life. She'd moved into a trailer park on the outskirts of Cascade, a rundown place called Mountain View Estates that had neither mountains nor views. She'd gotten a job waitressing at a truck stop diner, working late shifts that left her stumbling home at 2 a.m. smelling of grease and cigarette smoke. She'd also started using again. Thomas had seen the signs, the weight loss, the twitchy behavior, the paranoia. She'd failed 2 drug tests required by CPS, and her supervised visitation with Justin had been suspended. The boy hadn't seemed to mind. In fact, when Thomas had told him, Justin had simply said, "Good, I don't want to see her anyway." But Patricia wasn't alone in her dissent. She'd found a new boyfriend, Pedro Lowe, another small-time dealer who saw her as an easy mark. Pedro was smoother than Clint, smarter, more controlled. He didn't make the same mistakes, which meant Thomas needed to be smarter too. He'd started by befriending one of Pedro's competitors, a dealer named Armando Osborne who'd been trying to expand in a Cascades market. Armando had been grateful for the tip about Pedro's operations, and he'd been even more grateful when Thomas had provided him with detailed information about Pedro's supply chain, his customers, his safe houses. "Why are you helping me?" Armando had asked during one of their carefully orchestrated meetings at a neutral location. "Because Pedro's dating my ex-wife. Because he's supplying her with drugs. Because I want him gone. You want him dead? I want him ruined. There's a difference." Armando had grinned. "I can work with that." Over the next month, Pedro's operations had fallen apart. His suppliers had been busted in coordinated DEA raids. His customers had been poached by Armando's network. His safe houses had been robbed, his products stolen, his reputation destroyed. And then Armando had called Thomas with interesting news. "Pedro thinks your ex is snitching on him. He's convinced she's the reason everything's going to shit. Is he going to hurt her?" "No, man. He's just going to kick her to the curb. Already told her to get lost. She's out on the street." Which was exactly what Thomas had wanted. Patricia, broke and alone and desperate, had done exactly what Thomas had predicted. She'd come back to him, begging for help. She'd shown up at Flora's house, where Thomas and Justin were still staying while their house was being renovated. She looked terrible, skeletal, dirty, shaking from withdrawal. "Thomas, please. I need money. Just a loan. I'll pay you back." "No, please. I'm clean. I swear. I just need a little help to get back on my feet." "You're not clean, Patricia. You're high right now." She'd started crying. "I made mistakes. I know that. But I'm trying. I'm going to rehab. I'm going to get better. You've said that before. This time is different." "No, it's not." Thomas had looked at her, really looked at her, and felt nothing but pity. "You chose this life. You chose drugs over your son. You chose dangerous men over your family. Those were your decisions, and now you live with the consequences. You just going to abandon me? You abandoned yourself. She screamed at him then, called him every name she could think of, blamed him for everything that had gone wrong. But Thomas had simply closed the door and walked away. The last he'd heard, Patricia had left Cascade entirely, heading to Billings to stay with a cousin. Good riddance. But there was still one more piece of business to handle. Justin. His son had been through hell, and while therapy was helping, there were scars, mental and emotional, that would take years to heal. The boy flinched at loud noises, had nightmares most nights, struggled to trust anyone outside of Thomas and Flora. So Thomas had made a decision. He'd put in for a transfer to a non-deployable position, a training role at Fort Benning, Georgia. No more overseas deployments. No more leaving Justin for months at a time. Luther had signed off on it immediately. You've done your time, Black. You've earned this. Thomas had also put the Cascade house on the market and started looking for a place in Georgia, somewhere with good schools and safe neighborhoods. He'd called several therapists, found one who specialized in childhood trauma, and set up weekly appointments. And most importantly, he'd sat down with Justin one evening and asked him a question. If you could have anything in the world right now, what would it be? Justin had thought about it for a long time. Then, I'd want things to be normal again. Like before you left. When Mom was Mom, and we were a family. We can't go back, buddy, but we can go forward. You and me. Fresh start, new place, new life. What do you say? Justin had smiled. A small, fragile thing, but real. Yeah, Dad. That sounds good. Thomas had pulled his son into a hug, and in that moment, he'd known he'd made the right choice. The men who'd threatened Justin were in prison. Patricia was gone. The house would be sold, and he and his son would start over somewhere new, somewhere safe. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Chapter 7, Georgia Rising. 18 months later, Thomas Black stood in the backyard of his new home in Columbus, Georgia, watching Justin play catch with Donnie Foster, a neighbor kid who'd become his son's first real friend since the incident. The house was modest, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a fenced yard that backed up to a creek. Nothing fancy, but it was theirs. The Cascade house had sold for a decent price, and, combined with his military savings, Thomas had been able to... Justin was thriving. He'd joined the soccer team at his new school, his grades were back up, and the nightmares had become less frequent. He still saw his therapist, Dr. Rose Combs, a kind woman who specialized in trauma recovery, every week, and she'd reported significant progress. Thomas's new position at Fort Benning was exactly what he'd needed. He trained incoming Rangers, passing on the skills and knowledge he'd accumulated over 15 years of service. No deployments, no long absences. Home every night for dinner. It should have been enough. But some nights, Thomas lay awake thinking about Clint Roach, about Dale Ray and Ed Juarez, about the fact that while they were in prison, they were still alive, still breathing, still existing in the world that had almost taken his son from him. The legal system had done its job, but Thomas wasn't convinced it had done enough. And then, one morning in late October, he'd received a phone call that changed everything. Staff Sergeant Black, an unfamiliar voice, female, professional. Speaking. My name is Emily Wilkerson. I'm an investigative journalist with the Denver Post. I'm working on a story about methamphetamine distribution networks in the Rocky Mountain region, and your name came up in connection with an incident in Cascade, Montana. Thomas had gone very still. In what context? I've been investigating a dealer named Calvin Spider Morrison. Ring any bells? Should it? You made a call to him 18 months ago. An anonymous tip about a man named Clint Roach. Thomas had felt ice water run through his veins. I don't know what you're talking about. Mr. Black, I'm not trying to get you in trouble. I'm trying to understand the network. Spider Morrison is one of the largest meth distributors in the western United States. He's been connected to 17 murders, dozens of assaults, and millions of dollars in drug trafficking. But he's never been successfully prosecuted because people are afraid to testify. Sounds like a problem for law enforcement. It is, and I'm working with them. But I need people willing to tell their stories. People like you, who've been affected by this network. I'm not interested. Mr. Black, Thomas, what happened to your son was horrific. But you should know that Clint Roach wasn't just some random dealer. He was part of Spider Morrison's distribution network. So were Dale Ray and Ed Juarez. They were all working for him. Thomas had sat down slowly. Explain. Emily Wilkerson had explained. For 45 minutes, she'd laid out a network that stretched from Mexico to Montana, involving dozens of dealers, hundreds of users, and millions in dirty money. Spider Morrison was at the center of it all, a ghost who operated through intermediaries and left no traces. But Clint had kept records, detailed records, and when he'd been arrested, those records had been seized by police. Emily had obtained them through a Freedom of Information Act request, and she'd spent the last year piecing together the network. The problem, she'd said, is that Spider has people everywhere. In police departments, in courts, in prisons. He's protected. But if I can get enough victims willing to tell their stories, if I can show the human cost of his operation, it might be enough to push federal prosecutors into action. What do you need from me? An interview. On the record. About what happened that night. About how these men nearly killed your son. Thomas had thought about it for a long time. Going public meant reopening wounds that had just started to heal. It meant Justin's story becoming news, people knowing what had happened. It meant making themselves targets. But it also meant putting Spider Morrison in prison. It meant ensuring that the network that had almost destroyed his family would be dismantled. I'll do it, but I have conditions. Name them. My son stays anonymous. No photos, no names, no identifying details. This is my story, not his. Agreed. And I want to meet Spider Morrison's other victims. If I'm doing this, I want to know who else he's hurt. Emily had arranged a meeting 2 weeks later in Denver. Thomas had taken leave from Fort Benning and driven 16 hours to a conference room in a federal building, where he'd met 11 other people whose lives had been destroyed by Spider's network. There was Amber Shea, whose brother had died of an overdose from Spider's product. Max Mullins, whose daughter had been assaulted by one of Spider's dealers. Susanna Tucker, who'd been forced to cook meth in her own home under threat of violence. And there was Molly Owens. Molly was different from the others. She was a former chemist, one of the best in the business, who'd worked for Spider for 3 years before getting arrested. She'd agreed to testify against him in exchange for a reduced sentence, but she'd been in witness protection ever since because Spider's reach was long. He'll kill me if he finds me, she'd said matter-of-factly. He's killed 6 people who talked. I'll be number 7. But Molly had something the others didn't. Detailed knowledge of Spider's operation. She knew how the money was laundered, where the labs were located, who the major distributors were. She was the key to taking him down. Thomas had listened to all of them, and he'd realized something important. This was bigger than revenge. This was about justice. Emily's article had run 2 months later, a massive expose that detailed Spider Morrison's network and the human cost of his operation. Thomas's story had been featured prominently. How he'd returned from deployment to find his son in danger, how the dealers threatening Justin had been part of Spider's network, how the system had failed to protect his family. The article had caused a firestorm. Federal prosecutors had been forced to act, and a grand jury had been convened. Molly Owens had testified for 3 days, laying out the entire operation in excruciating detail. Spider Morrison had been indicted on 63 counts of drug trafficking, murder, conspiracy, and racketeering. But the story didn't end there. Chapter 8, The Trial. The trial of Calvin Spider Morrison began on a hot July morning in Denver, 14 months after Emily Wilkerson's article had been published. Thomas had been called as a witness, and he'd taken 2 weeks of leave to attend. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Spider Morrison had run a massive drug distribution network that had killed or destroyed hundreds of lives. They had financial records, testimony from cooperating witnesses, and physical evidence linking him to multiple crimes. The defense's case was equally simple. Spider was a legitimate businessman who'd been unfairly targeted because of his past. Any crimes committed by his associates had been done without his knowledge or approval. It was, in Thomas's opinion, complete bullshit. He'd taken a stand on day 6 of the trial, and he'd told his story. About the deployment. About the phone call. About arriving home to find his son in danger. About the men who'd threatened Justin being part of Spider's network. The defense attorney, a slick man named Nick Horn who specialized in representing organized crime figures, had tried to rattle him on cross-examination. "Mr. Black, isn't it true that you have a personal vendetta against my client?" "No. You made an anonymous call to him, tipping him off about Clint Roach." "I don't recall doing that." "The phone records show." "I don't recall doing that," Thomas had repeated, his voice flat and cold. Horn had tried a different approach. "You brought military assets into a civilian situation without proper authorization. Isn't that illegal?" "I requested assistance in a hostage situation. My commanding officer responded appropriately. But you didn't follow proper channels. My son was about to be killed. I didn't have time for channels. So you took the law into your own hands. I protected my family. If that's a crime, charge me." Horn had backed off, realizing he was losing the jury. Molly Owens had been the star witness. She testified for 3 days, describing in detail how Spider's operation worked. The labs, the distribution, the violence. She provided dates, locations, names. She'd been unshakable on cross-examination, and by the time she'd stepped down, the prosecution's case had been airtight. But the defense had one final trick. On the last day of testimony, they'd called a surprise witness, Patricia Mayer Black. Thomas had felt his stomach drop when she'd walked into the courtroom. She looked better than the last time he'd seen her, cleaner, healthier, like she'd finally gotten sober. But there was something hard in her eyes, something bitter. The defense attorney had asked her about the night of the incident. "Ms. Mayer, can you tell us what happened that evening?" Patricia had glanced at Thomas, and he'd seen the calculation in her expression. She'd been paid off. "Had to be. Clint and his friends were at my house," she'd said. "They were high. Yeah, but they weren't going to hurt Justin. That was all a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding? Justin had been mouthing off, being disrespectful. Clint was just trying to scare him straight. He would never have actually hurt him. And when your ex-husband arrived with military personnel, he overreacted, completely blew the situation out of proportion. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Christy Cross, had torn Patricia apart on cross-examination. "Ms. Mayer, your son called his father in terror, saying men were betting on who would kill him first. You're saying that was a misunderstanding. Kids exaggerate. The police found drugs and weapons in your home. You're saying that was safe. It wasn't my drugs. You failed multiple drug tests since then, haven't you? I've had some setbacks. You lost custody of your son because you endangered his life, correct?" Patricia had glared at her. "That was my ex-husband's fault. He turned everyone against me. By saving your son's life?" The jury hadn't bought it. Neither had the judge. Spider Morrison had been convicted on all 63 counts. Sentencing had been scheduled for 6 weeks later, with prosecutors recommending 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Thomas had left the courtroom feeling empty. It was over. Spider was going to prison. Clint, Dale, and Ed were already there. Patricia had humiliated herself on national television, and her testimony had likely earned her perjury charges. Justice had been served, but Thomas still felt like something was unfinished. Chapter 9. The Endgame. 3 months after the trial, Thomas received a letter. It was from Clint Roach, sent from the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, where he was serving his sentence. The letter was short. "You won. I know that. But you should know something. I never touched your kid. I was high and talking shit, but I wouldn't have hurt him. I'm not a monster. But you made me into one. You ruined my life. You took everything from me. And I just wanted you to know that I hope you're happy. I hope it was worth it." Thomas had read the letter twice, then burned it in his fireplace. Because Clint was wrong. He had touched Justin, maybe not physically, but the damage was done all the same. The boy still had nightmares. He still flinched at loud voices. He still checked the locks on doors 3 times before bed. Clint Roach had broken something in his son, and no amount of "I was just talking shit" would fix it. A week later, Thomas received another letter. This one was from Spider Morrison, also from federal prison. "Sergeant Black, you cost me my freedom, my business, my reputation. I want you to know that I have a long memory and a long reach. Your boy is 12 now, 13. That's a dangerous age. Accidents happen. Sleep tight." Thomas had taken the letter directly to the FBI. They'd opened an investigation into witness intimidation, and Spider's privileges had been revoked. But the message was clear. This wasn't over. Thomas had made a decision that night. He'd sat down with Justin and had a conversation he'd been dreading. "Buddy, I need to talk to you about something serious." Justin had looked up from his homework. "What's wrong?" "The man who ran the network, the boss of the guys who threatened you. He's in prison, but he's still trying to hurt us. He sent me a threatening letter." Justin had gone pale. "What did it say?" "It doesn't matter. What matters is that we're going to be okay. But I need you to be more careful. Don't walk home alone. Don't talk to strangers. If anything feels wrong, you call me immediately." "Are we in danger?" "Not if I can help it." But Thomas knew words weren't enough. He needed to ensure Spider Morrison could never hurt his family again. He made some calls. Mike Lyons had connections in the federal prison system, guards who owed him favors, inmates who could be persuaded to take certain actions. It wasn't legal. It wasn't clean. But Thomas had long since stopped caring about the rules. "What do you need?" Mike had asked. "I need Spider Morrison to understand that threatening my family has consequences." "What kind of consequences?" "The permanent kind." Mike had been quiet for a long time. "You sure about this?" "I'm sure." 2 weeks later, Spider Morrison had been found dead in his cell. Apparent suicide. He'd hanged himself using a bedsheet, according to the official report. The FBI hadn't bought it. Neither had the media. But without evidence of foul play, the case had been closed. Thomas had received one final letter, this one from an anonymous source. "The debt is paid. He won't bother you again." Thomas had burned that letter too. 6 months later, Thomas stood in the stands of a high school soccer field, watching Justin score the winning goal in the regional championship. The boy had grown, taller now, broader in the shoulders, with a confidence that had been missing before. After the game, Justin had run over, sweaty and grinning. "Did you see that, Dad? Did you see?" "I saw. I'm proud of you, buddy." Justin had hugged him, and in that moment, Thomas had felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. The nightmares were gone. The fear was gone. His son was healing. And the men who tried to destroy him, Clint, Dale, Ed, Spider, Patricia, were all either in prison or out of their lives forever. Thomas Black had kept his promise. He'd protected his family, and he'd done it his way. As they walked back to the car, Justin had asked, "Dad, do you think Mom will ever come back?" "I don't know, buddy. Do you want her to?" Justin had thought about it. "No, I don't think so. I like things the way they are now. Just you and me." "Me too, son. Me too." They'd driven home in comfortable silence, the Georgia's sun setting behind them, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Thomas Black had been a soldier, a father, and when necessary, a man willing to do terrible things to protect the people he loved. He'd broken rules, bent laws, and crossed lines that most people wouldn't even approach. But his son was safe. His family was whole. And that was all that mattered. The rest, the guilt, the questions, the sleepless nights wondering if he'd gone too far, was a price he was willing to pay. Because some things were worth fighting for. Some things were worth killing for. And family was everything. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.